now the work begins. It is my honor to be the chair of the first session, the first keynote, and today we will have a speech or a talk by Professor Singh from University of Edinburgh. His topic will be what global cultural flows tell us about our interests and values, and what can we do about them? Let me first introduce you Professor Singh. He's a chair of culture and political economy and director of the Centre for Cultural Relations at the University of Edinburgh. He has impressive academic record. For example, he has authored 5 monographs, edited 3 books, and published dozens of scholarly articles. His book, Globalized Arts, the Entertainment, Economy, and Cultural Identity, published in 2011, has won the American Political Science Association Award for Best Book, and he has edited volumes such as Globalization, Culture, and Development. He's working on a new book, which we are all looking forward to. It's called Development 2.0, How Technologies Can Foster Inclusivity in the Developing World. He is also editor of journals such as Arts and International Affairs, and also Stanford's book series, Emerging Frontiers in the Global Economy. More than that, he is also working with international organizations such as UNESCO, World Bank, and World Trade Organization. I would now like to give the floor to Professor Singh.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction, and thank you to all of you for being here. My special thanks to the Scientific Committee and Dr. Indra Kebrus for inviting me to come here. Thank you, Jenny, for remembering our bus ride. 2 years before that is the first time that I came for ICCPR in Vienna, and in many ways that was the conference which for me was a pivotal point for me to continue working on international cultural policies. I had just begun to conceive the book that you so kindly mentioned, Globalized Arts, which, by the way, didn't win the, I must correct this because I might have colleagues watching back home. It was APS's best book in information technology and politics, and not the best book, because that's reserved for higher persons than me. So that 12 years later, now I'm strongly ensconced in cultural policy research. In response to Dr. Abrus's cultural flows, I must mention to you that I've had a wonderful cultural reunion with people from the country of my birth and that of the diaspora right here in Tallinn. All of India and its diaspora is here, and they're all in UNESCO Old City, the UNESCO Heritage Site. We are all here. I'm probably the last Indian to arrive in Tallinn. And so Tallinn seems to be quite the place. I thought first, maybe it's a Bollywood film, but I was quickly reminded, no, it's the IT industry. And there went my academic dream of all of India being interested in the Hanseatic League and what it's done for the world. What I'm going to take you through is the following: a few reflections on cultural flows as they were in a not too recent past, and they've come undone, and many of our speakers have referred to that. And I'll go through what happened. What was the tragedy in which we sit today? And then I'll try to offer some reflections rooted in research that we've been doing at Edinburgh. And as you can see from that slide there, call me a Brexit casualty. I'll be back in States in a couple of weeks. I love my job in Edinburgh, but I must blame our politics for for disruptions. And the disruption in my life was that it just didn't work politically and personally for me to make this permanent move. So I'll try to end on a hopeful note in terms of the prospects and what options do we have in front of us, referencing some research that we've done at the Institute for International Cultural Relations. So in 1947, the war has ended, and we are trying to think of how can we have a better world. And what comes out of that are many initiatives. One of them is the Edinburgh International Festival. As people in Edinburgh like to say, this refugee from Vienna, Rudolf Bing, started the festival. He was actually already in UK in some ways. He had been the director of the Glenbourne Festival, etc. But he was part of a generation trying to think of what the war had done to us and what would be the communal places that we could all come together and shape a better world. And the idea of the Edinburgh International Festival was to offer a common meal, a commensality of sorts, for people to come and share culture, and so that we would get along. That was the idea of the festival. It remains in many ways the idea of the festivals all over the world today. And many institutions also were founded as a result of those post-war efforts. And Rudolf Bing, who would then move and had a flourishing career at the Met Opera, it led that movement in terms of cultural festivals. The quote that you have there from the historian Angela Barty was for the 1952 submission that the Edinburgh International Festival put forth for the Nobel Peace Prize. And what the quote epitomizes is the fact that culture somehow brings us together in ways in which other aspects of life might not, because it readily speaks to our ways of life, and it speaks to our representations. After all, Rudolf Bing and people of that cohort are coming after a great war. 73 million people have been killed, 63 million people from the Allied powers, 12 million from the Axis powers, including 6 million people who died in the Holocaust. When we think of what is happening in our midst right now in terms of our cultural politics, think of that moment not as one of the greatest tragedies of humankind, but as the place where something great was born. It was not just the Edinburgh International Festival. Many things came out of that. In this time, I would go on to say, in this time of cultural hatreds, led by some hugely important people in power, we have a moment from 1945 or 1947, if you want to think of the festival, as a moment in which people thought, and they said, maybe we can shape a better future. And one of those initiatives, as we all know, especially in a gathering like this, was UNESCO. The symbol chosen was that of Pallas Athena. If you go to the UNESCO website, as I went today just to check a few things, they've taken off the Pallas Athena reference. It just says the temple. And maybe that speaks to universalizing languages, which in many ways UNESCO embodies. But it was the temple of Pallas Athena which would epitomize this move forward. And everybody at UNESCO can recite the preamble, that wars begin in the minds of men. It is in the minds of men that defenses of peace must be constructed. In 1942, there was a speech given by Prime Minister Clement Attlee, and then appropriated for the UNESCO preamble by US Poet Laureate Archibald MacLeish. It was really speaking to how culture lies within our minds, and that the way to push forward was to acknowledge that and to design institutions which would speak to those moments. This was not the first time that we designed new institutions when a war had ended. This painting from Bartholomeus van der Hulst of the Amsterdam Civic Guard comes in 1648. There were several Civic Guard paintings. This is one of them. And what you have to my right is the captain congratulating the lieutenant for the end of the 30 Years' War. On the table lies the treaty, the Peace of Münster, which would introduce for us the world that went to war in the 20th century, the world of nation states. On the drum is a poem to peace by the poet John Vose. So we've been there before. What this moment in history introduced to us was, among other things, what came to be known as the bourgeois peace. A peace that would lie in interactions among human beings, and it would be led through commerce. It would be led through our exchanges with each other, and we would shape diplomacies as a result. François de Callière in 1716 writes on the manner of negotiating with princes, and this book, one of the first diplomatic texts, would speak to the idea that it's through diplomacy that we can make a better world. And François de Callière would write about, at that time, Europe as consisting of members of one republic, and that no considerable change, he says, can take place in that republic through one member, which wouldn't, in some ways, cast an apple of discord for all the others involved in that peace. It was an idea that there was an international society at work. This is 1716, that an apple of discord would spoil the peace of all the other members. What I want you to be thinking about is how we visited these moments before, and how are we looking at 1716 from the eyes of 2016. 3 centuries later, and maybe a moment like Brexit, which makes us think of what François de Callière was writing about. Nonetheless, through that great war in the 17th century, to François Callière writing this in the early 18th century, what was born in Europe was a perpetual peace of sorts, a bourgeois peace. People like Adam Smith. I couldn't possibly come from the University of Edinburgh and not talk of Adam Smith. This is the statue of Adam Smith on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh. Adam Smith said that it is within our nature that we would be interested in the fortunes of others. What he was pointing towards was not the normative principle that François de Callière had at heart about how diplomacy should be practiced, but that we are all tied to each other, and your fortune affects my fortunes. And therefore, we would have to get along. We'd have to be tolerant of each other. And therefore, we had the cities of Europe, including this one of the great Hanseatic League cities, where through that necessary commerce, people would be tied with each other. Alexis de Tocqueville, when he's writing about democracy in America, and he's speaking of how neighbors talk to neighbors, therefore we have democracy, at the basis of his thought had the same principles that Adam Smith was speaking to, which is that trade is about moderation, that it kills violent passions, and therefore through trade we would get along. So we've had, before the events of 2016, 2017, the present day, we've had the great wars make us pause, and we can go back to the 17th century and think of the institutions we designed there and wonder how we've visited those moments in the past and what happens. We still, on the other hand, know very well, all of us do in this room, that we have our conflicts. So what happened? Underlying that bourgeois peace was a great oppression of people. Césaire was talking to the fact that Hitler introduced Europe to policies that the coolies of India, the Arabs of Algeria, or the niggers of Africa, this is an exact quote from Césaire, had already known for 200 years. Underlying that bourgeois peace was colonialism. That too is still with us, the effects of post-colonialism. Perhaps the very same antipathy that people felt in 1930s are still being felt today. And so we have to figure out, through that liberal enlightenment, through that Scottish enlightenment, have we come to terms with dealing with the other? Or is it that some part of that still continues in our midst? Quite recently, I did a book called Sweet Talk. And although it wasn't on cultural policies, I think it's pertinent to what we're speaking of here. I wanted to be able to quantitatively measure the effects of post-colonial racism. I called it paternalism on our current policies. So I came up with a paternalism strength index. For those of you who are methodologists, it used factor analysis. In other words, it looked at latent variables among a whole set of indices to come up with what I call paternalism strength index. And I found that paternalism strength index over and above other factors was very strongly correlated to the lack of concessions given to the developing world in trade. I was mostly concerned with policies coming out of the World Trade Organization, but this goes against the received wisdom today in America and other places that somehow the global south has come and plundered the riches of the developed world through trade policies. In fact, it's the opposite. Paternalism in the post-war era is strongly correlated with the lack of trade concessions made to the developing world. Now, I'm referencing trade policies here, but we could equally speak of paternalistic UNESCO policies, a grand global ministry of culture telling the world what to do. And so when we have moments like intangible cultural heritage come out of the global south and other places, first there's a collective gasp. But then I would also say, just as I have been able to do this research, many other people in this room have been able to do research, which sort of moves us forward a little bit, thinking of the spaces within which some things can be different. And UNESCO, too, in that sense, I would say, has made a difference in many places. So I've spoken to the economics that didn't work out since that Peace of Westphalia or after World War II. What about our politics? This is taken from Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. Not until I was preparing for this talk that I realized, wow, the boundary really runs very close to Estonia, doesn't it? No? So we are at the last outpost of Western civilization here, according to Huntington. And so one may speak of the fact that despite all our global institutions and despite all our longing for universalism, we still have a reminder of where the old lines run. I was just at the Tallinn City Museum, and upstairs on what would be the American third floor was the Soviet-era exhibit, and that's the darkest room in the museum. And I don't know if the lighting is meant to be like that, but the contrast between the well-lit Hanseatic exhibits and the trading and the commerce and the crafts versus the Soviet-era room is quite remarkable. It's not just internationally that we have our fissures. I don't mean to suggest that somehow global north or the east versus the west is responsible for all those problems. I've just picked up a couple of slides to remind us of the world we live in today. This is a slide of Jarl Farber's play that was also given at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival a couple of years ago, Nirbhaya. It was based on the gruesome December 2012 rape of Jyoti Pandey in India, as she and her boyfriend boarded a bus. And it was a reminder of the number of fissures and conflicts that exist in our world today. Going to another continent, this here is a reminder of the 1 million Hutus and Tutsis that died in 1994. So since 1648, or 1945, or 1947, we fashioned institutions. And where have we come? I think it's, for me, best epitomized in this quote from Richard Hoggart, who wrote Master and Its Servants, which is just a great book on UNESCO. After critiquing UNESCO for what it does and the battles that it fights, towards the end of the book, he comes back to if we need UNESCO. And he says, we do. Not in the Machiavellian sense, because he's just spoken to all the politics within UNESCO. He says we need it because it's like King Lear. I've often thought about what did he mean by that quote. Does he mean this narcissistic king who fashions UNESCO in his narcissism, thinking that he can change the world? Or is it that, as in Kurosawa's Ran, the king lies defeated at the end, and there's nothing but a spiritual path forward? Whichever way it is, it's a great metaphor for where we come after we lie defeated with all our efforts and we find ourselves in politics that are disturbing. So having told you about our current cultural moment and how we can trace it back in history, and very briefly taken you through how, despite all our best endeavors, we still have conflicts amidst us. Let me take you through some possibilities on where we might move forward, and how those possibilities might come through the world that all of us here study: cultural politics and policies, creative industries, etc. Somebody might say, well, first and foremost, that's a lot to ask for from art. As the artist Art Reinhardt reminds us, art is art. We shouldn't be thinking of art as putting us on some kind of a pedestal in which we are supposed to get along with each other, or that a museum space or a theater performance like Rudolf Bing, etc., imagined in 1947, would bring the world together. One might ask why. Why not art as form? One of my colleagues at Edinburgh College of Art, every time I get into a political argument with her about art, she says, you know, most of my time I spend thinking about form. And of course, being a rightful scholar, I would turn around and say, but form is political. But through those conversations, I've also begun to appreciate the fact that when an artist is speaking of form, it's not all politics. Otherwise, there wouldn't be two different words, one called form and the other one called politics. So we have to appreciate that art has its place, and that one of the places for art is greater than its politics. Second quote that I pulled out speaks to those politics quite explicitly. Julian Stallebras, in writing this, is actually from one of those Oxford introductions, but I really like it. It's called Contemporary Art. And he's ruminating on where we are with contemporary art. And for him, gone is the sort of grand imagery of art and linearity of art. Instead, he's speaking of art as a fractal place, as multidimensional, as many things, rather than just one thing. And he's also saying, without quite saying so, that we've arrived at a moment in the first quote there, which is quite cosmopolitan, that it has these universal values, but they're multidimensional. But then, a few pages forth, he says it quite explicitly. By Biennales, and those are sort of the ultimate arts festivals these days, he says they address the cosmopolitan art audience rather than the local population. This right now, by the way, is the tragedy of the Edinburgh festivals too. In many ways, one of the worries that the City Council has in Edinburgh is that the festivals are so disconnected from what Edinburgh is all about. Locals anywhere complain about tourism, and so do the people of Edinburgh complain about the Edinburgh festivals. But in many ways, the Edinburgh festivals also excluded Edinburgh. Edinburgh International Festival itself was seen as very elitist at times. It was only in the recent past that it's begun to showcase Scottish productions. Rudolf Bing's idea of art bringing people together was there was going to be high art, fine art, tasteful art. Fringe was a rebellion to that. And now many people think of the Fringe itself as the festival. Edinburgh Festival is actually 12 festivals, of which Edinburgh International Festival and the Edinburgh Fringe Festival are 2 of them. However, for many people in Scotland and in Edinburgh, just as for biennales the world over, the local populations are not quite involved in that very exercise which at an ideal level is supposed to bring people together. And in some ways, that quote about the cosmopolitan art audiences rather than the local populations addresses that. Just as we've arrived at that multi-dimensional space of universalism, we've left out the locals. When I was working on globalized arts, I was trying to see where we get our cultural policies, and for that I had a lot of scholarship that I've tried to kind of synthesize into that one diagram there, and a lot of that scholarship came from this room. And I was interested in how would I explain at that time these cultural policies of identity, the ones for universalism versus the ones for a kind of a parochialism. And I traced it back to our anxieties, the anxieties that somebody in Edinburgh might feel being divorced from the places of that festival, or an anxiety that I might feel in a global trading order that leaves me out. And so in many ways, what I want to suggest in terms of possibilities is that we have to speak of the human condition, not as the one which aspires to universalism, but the human condition that's anxious. And art comes in somewhere there. What does it do to our anxiety? And what kind of art do we want to see? Especially with the kinds of hyper technologies that we have today. That my anxiety about who I am might be shared by 2 million people, and those 2 million people might be hated by 200 million, but I have my 2 million, and I can find them on the internet. And that's the milieu within which we are now shaping our cultural policies. I've often thought about Martin Roth's resignation after Brexit from the Victoria and Albert Museum. And I've thought about the kind of cosmopolitanism that informed that quote. It's tragic. But let's think about it for a second. What happened to tolerance, says Martin Roth? Solidarity and charity. And I am not a dreamer. I'm just talking about basic values, manners that are part of our upbringing and connect us. Where are they now? I share that sentiment, but at the same time, I wonder if that person who has always felt excluded from the Edinburgh International Festival and might have been part of that 26% vote in Edinburgh that voted for Brexit, what would they make of that quote? No. And that's where we have to re-examine our cosmopolitanisms and think very deeply about where such art takes us. Let me give you the parochial language that comes out from the other side. And by the way, I'm going to put up a quote here from Amartya Sen. I don't mean to imply that Amartya Sen is parochial. As I was thinking about these slides sitting at the back, I thought, I should have cautioned. I'm just using what Amartya Sen is saying about identity and violence in his book to speak to how we can be parochial, all of us, at different times. My book, Globalized Art, is eventually about cultural identity. But this is what Amartya Sen says about that cultural identity, including that of the person who's just voted for Brexit and says, this is not the world I want. I'm going to stop such and such peoples and goods and flows at the borders. Okay? What Amartya Sen is saying is those types of cultural identity politics lead us to the miniaturization of human beings. I am white. I'm evangelical. I live in Mississippi. I'm from the Midlands, I'm white, I'm retired. That's the miniaturization of human beings that Amartya Sen is speaking to. And in that violence that comes out of that miniaturization, he says multidimensional human beings are turned into one-dimensional creatures. We don't live in a binary world, but the binary that I've created for you is a cosmopolitanism that leaves people out, and a parochialism that does the same. So whichever strategy we favor here, we are going to leave out a vast humanity of people. What I'd also like to suggest at this point is that if we live in a static world, that's how we would think. Fortunately for us, we don't. We don't live in a static world. We would like to think we live in a static world. In a static world of social scientists, what you have is a conception of power or our interests that go around in a circle because there's a cultural context in which we get our interests, and therefore we have preferences as a result of that interest. I favor a particular kind of policy, outcomes, and I keep going back into the same culture. There's no escape from it. If there was no escape from it, we wouldn't have the kind of cultural politics we have today. The fact is there is an escape from it, and through those successive interactions, cultures change, interests change. While we have the tragedy of our current cultural politics, our interests and preferences have changed. So where do we go next with that? What I'm going to do here in a very selfish way now is to suggest two avenues, but I hope that my selfishness is shared by those many others in the room. All we can do as researchers is continue to do our research. Okay. And so this is the research that we've been doing since 2016, and I'm going to reference two of those things. One was a study that I took up, and I hope I can be really honest here, even though I realize that this is being recorded. I took up a study for the British Council on soft power, and I really didn't like the term soft power. I didn't think it did much for the world. And as we did the study, I convinced myself that it did. What I did was really a quantitative study of, does soft power make a difference in the world? To particular types of outcomes. In other words, in this particular case, interactions that are not about hard power, about military, etc. And that soft power would include cultural diplomacy. Does it make a difference in the world? And one of the things we tried to do in that study was to divorce resources of soft power from outcomes. Because power, as we know, has a tautology. It matters when we see the outcomes of what exactly was it that mattered. So we divorced the resources of soft power from the outcomes of soft power, and what we found is right up there. That democracy, citizen prosperity, and strong cultural institutions are strongly linked with social, cultural, economic, and political benefits for countries with soft power. It's somewhat poignant doing this in a country which is moving away from those outcomes in some ways since 2016. And it's not just the UK which is moving away from them. We might think of other countries that are moving away from those soft power axes. But we were surprised. The fact is, we live in a world in which there are flows. What we tried to do was these were our dependent variables, so as to say. Okay? Do countries which have soft power attract more students? Do they attract more foreign direct investment? Do they attract more tourists? Do they have influence politically? So these were our dependent variables, the number of foreign students, and we wondered if those were related to soft power. This is a table on international tourist arrivals. Does soft power make a difference there? FDI flows, foreign direct investment flows. Does soft power matter there? And then there was a fourth dependent variable, and I haven't put that in here, which is about does soft power allow you to have more influence politically? And the way we measured it was through UNGA data, on UN General Assembly data. And what we found in these scatter diagrams here, and also in multiple regression analysis later, was that yes, if you're democratic, if you're prosperous, and you have strong cultural institutions, you're a magnet for students, you're a magnet for tourists, you're a magnet for FDI, and you have international political influence. And that's what these charts are showing. And we measured all of those variables in many, many different ways, but all very strongly correlated with a few variations here and there that were sort of interesting. I can go through that later. By the way, I do have a copy of that study here, but you can download it, and this one I'll leave here for anybody who wants to take it, but I did bring a copy of that soft power study. Friends shouldn't show friends their coefficients, so I wouldn't show you that many. But this one over here is basically showing how democracy, prosperity, cultural institutions are strongly correlated with, in this particular case, student attraction. But we ran these models for foreign direct investment, we ran them for tourism, we ran them for UN General Assembly data, and this is what surprised us. That yes, if you're rigorous about soft power indices, then at the end you do see correlation. So in many ways, Joseph Nye was right. Okay. But in terms of the strong possibility of a better world through soft power, the tragedy, of course, we have today is that the world is moving away from it. In a macro sort of way. Okay? Because this has enlivened my interest and several other people's interest in what soft power can do. And what we're also seeing is that at the meso and the micro levels, countries remain interested because it brings them benefits. Okay. They may be students, they may be foreign direct investment, they may be political influences, but countries are interested in soft power at that level. which means perhaps not just that Joseph Nye was right, but that Adam Smith was right. We are interested in the fortunes of others, especially as those fortunes affect us. Because Adam Smith was telling us through the benevolence of the butcher and the brewer that we get our meat and wine. I'm sorry, it's not through the benevolence of the butcher and the brewer that we get our meat and wine, but through their regard to their self-interest. That self-interest at some level will motivate us to interact with others. And in so much as the interactions are positive, perhaps there's something to be desired there. Again, a word of caution. People don't like tourists. We don't like foreign direct investment either. If we've been listening to Trump's rhetoric, that is the problem, along with Germany and Canada. Canada, as you know, is about to invade the United States, according to President Trump. These abstract flows may mean very little to the individual who has decided in the last few years to shut out the world. That individual may not want those students in Edinburgh or Oxford or Cambridge or wherever they might be in Tallinn or George Mason University where I'll be returning. They may not want foreign direct investment. They may not care about the UN. So what does it matter to have influence at the UN? So yes, in some ways, these sort of extensive interactions bring benefits. And at some level, at some meso-bureaucratic or a micro level, we care about them, but the world may be moving away from these types of interactions. I don't have an answer there in terms of how do we reverse that flow, except to suggest that Adam Smith wasn't believed in his times either. No. And that it's taken us since 1776 to arrive here, and perhaps there's a lot of work still to be done. And surprises that might come forth. Let me now turn to, in the last few minutes, to a more intensive form of interaction that we carried out. We'd done the soft power study, and we wanted to do something that brought the world together in more intensive interactions to test that hypothesis that Rudolf Bing and others had put forth, that people, as they consume, as they partake, as they sit across from each other in cultural spaces, learn from each other and that we get along with each other. So what we carried out was a research exercise modeled on participatory action research. We brought forth 33 community activists from around the world, many of them involved in culture, to deliberate at a very intensive level what the Edinburgh festivals were doing. So we deliberated our cultural interests and values and divided them into 7 different tasks or 7 different sub-issues. And I'm going to play you a snippet of a film from one of the last sessions. It was the second last sessions where the Global Cultural Fellows spoke about why we have cultural wars in our midst. My apologies in advance. The clip I chose is kind of self-explanatory, but I realized that it's all men. The 33 fellows, there was a lot of representation there, including gender representation. We were very sensitive to that. But they self-chose, the fellows self-chose the sessions that they were going to lead, and you're going to be listening to the leaders. And I wondered why it was all the men who led the session on culture wars. But this is too small a sample to draw generalizations. So if we could play that small clip, please.
So yesterday we were exploring the theme of cultural wars, and I was trying to focus on the conflict itself, and especially the pre-conflict phase, because I do believe that there are some indicators in the cultures and in the art expressions that tell that the risk of conflict is there, and what's the role of art to mitigate this risk. And within conflict, sometimes, unfortunately, the cultures and arts are being used as a weapon sometimes by local and international actors. So my question was, do we need really to use the cultures and art as a tool of influencing the change that we need within conflict?
What means to be a local or to think a local and acting in a global environment? It is related with the problems of the terms globalization and the relationship between the commercial traits and the cultural traits. how we manage and how we be fluent between these two fields.
I focus on the battle between the private and the public financing of the arts, and whether there is an argument to support how the community consider the best way, the best model to finance and sustain the arts.
Finally, we found an idea of identity and the problem of the identity as a place or a moment when you found borders to define yourself.
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing yesterday was about the moral values of the arts, and do we need to have any limitations for art expressions or cultural expressions? Sometimes, in some contexts, art expressions could lead to conflict itself, that art expressions should have no limits. We didn't reach to a conclusion, and that's really interesting for me because I really want to explore both arguments, and then maybe each one of us, maybe we can apply this in his context or her context in a different way.
We'll be holding a very interesting discussion because we come from all different backgrounds. So the idea of private and public becomes sometimes merged.
I'm promoting the Institute here, but I also want to promote the films that we prepared on these participatory deliberations. They're in the current issue of Arts and International Affairs. I put flyers at the back there, but if you go to the artsjournal.net, all of the films are there, and our documentary filmmaker was steeped in visual anthropology techniques, and I think they're remarkable for what they do in terms of these 33 global cultural fellows coming together to debate the value of the arts and what can they do for us. Karim, who you saw, is a doctor for CARE International, had worked in Syria. He's of Syrian origin himself, and so we didn't just have cultural policy officials. At the end of those deliberations, and you'll see on all the films, they don't reach any grand conclusion. But the fellows continued their fellowship for 1 year, which has just come to an end, and what they did is what we do as human beings. They formed their common rituals. The idea of all of them debating is perhaps the biggest takeaway from this. That at some level they spoke a universal language which was multidimensional, didn't have a grand conclusion, but that there was a ritual that brought them together. And perhaps that was the ritual that Rudolf Bing had in mind, or the ritual that Anthony van Dyck is speaking of in that Amsterdam Civic Guard. And as rituals, we've had this before. This here is an ostrakon. It'll be familiar to you. It was the tablet that was used in ancient Greece to throw people outside of city walls if they weren't behaving themselves in the polis. And from that we get democracy, of course. We also get ostracization. And we noticed similar kinds of narratives in the 33 Global Cultural Fellows. As they deliberated, we saw fissures develop. Whether it was gender, whether it was class, whether it was taste, high taste, low taste, etc. And so deliberation is going to lead us. In intensive interactions like this are not the way out of conflict. In fact, they might themselves produce conflict. And Karim was speaking to that himself, and we're all aware of how art can also engender conflict. But I would say that for me, after 1 year of these Global Cultural Fellows deliberations and listening to them, one thing that stands out is how closely bonded the 33 of them are. That was perhaps the best story to tell about that program. Not that they came to an understanding about what universalism means, but they came to an understanding to the fact that the 33 of them, together from around the world, could partake in a ritual which, if I might sound too idealistic, might make the world better. I'm going to go back to another Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, in this case from whom Adam Smith drew inspiration and was his best friend in some ways, David Hume. And what David Hume is saying is that all argumentation takes place in a social context. He is not one for relegating passions away. In fact, it's from passions, he says. And that's what Adam Smith would later call moral sentiments, our affections for each other. And David Hume is saying that it's through our affections from each other, which belong in a particular social context, that we fashion truth. But that truth comes out of argumentation. It's not human reason, but that argumentation is the way to move forward. It is not reason, he says, which is the guide of life, but custom. And it's important to remember now, as we have several customs around the world, and I've mentioned two of them, cosmopolitanism and parochialism, that we do argue within those customs. And what our Global Cultural Fellows did also was develop a custom, the 33 of them, which spoke a universal language, but it was multidimensional. I would say that that same language brought in parochialism. So you heard Manuel de Viveros from Colombia speak to that. Manuel Viveros, who you saw in that film, works on guerrilla art in Colombia, and how that was so important through the conflict that Colombia has had. And to him, that is the language of parochialism that is very important to remember through globalization. Let me now, in conclusion, take us to a slightly more abstract level. What do we then make of these global cultural flows, which, as I've said over here, allowed us to fashion global cultural institutions through a war in the 17th century? Nation states arose out of that. Or in the 20th century, we get the United Nations or the Edinburgh Festivals to this moment today. How shall we think conceptually about these possibilities in terms of moving forward? I've suggested two possibilities: extensive interactions through things like soft power, or intensive interactions through human beings talking with each other. I want to return to my favorite philosopher, Paulo Freire. Every time I speak of Paulo Freire, somebody reminds me that I should move on, that Paulo Freire was so 1970s. But I keep going back to Paulo Freire for one simple insight, that human beings not just love to talk with each other, we like to name our world. And for Paulo Freire, there is no praxis without that. That to speak the truth is to name our world. And we must remember that the cultural politics in which we are today, with all its cultural flows, are people trying to name their world, for better or for worse. Richard Hargett, in that book that I just mentioned, also has this beautiful summation of what Pablo Neruda did in UNESCO, which made me stop to think about what those moments can do for us. And he speaks to Pablo Neruda in frail health, standing before the UNESCO General Assembly, reciting his poetry, and he notes it was as if the poor of his native Chile, of all Latin America, of the whole world, walked sadly and in silent reproof through that elegant hall evoked by Neruda's passion and poetry. What I'm suggesting here is that art has that representational responsibility, whether or not we like to admit it. And what we've had through the United Nations, or what we've had through those Brexit moments, or through Anthony van Dyck's Amsterdam Civic Guard painting, is exactly what Neruda is talking about, those representations. And those representations, which now, in many ways, I have spoken to as giving us a cosmopolitan possibility, in some ways divorced from many, and a parochial possibility, which also is very divorced. I'll be honest with you, I think with many people in this room, I share the cosmopolitan possibility. And part of the exercise lies in speaking to these sorts of representations that Freire is speaking to, and also that Neruda is evoking through his poetry. But in my last slide, I'm going to leave you with something else that remains very, very important. Last year in the Edinburgh Film House, which is now part of the Edinburgh Film Festival, I watched Andrei Zhyagintseev's Lovelessness. And I was depressed for days, because it's really speaking of Putin's Russia. And lovelessness, without giving the story away, is really this condition of these human beings that have no politics. They've given up. And that's why it was so depressing, that we arrived at a moment where individuals have that condition of lovelessness. And I came out of my depression because I don't think any of us have given up. And we're constantly reminded of that. And beyond the representations, what Freire was speaking of was praxis. That's representation plus action or practice. And so I've just put up 2 representations there of exactly that. I don't think the world is headed towards lovelessness. We weren't headed there with Anthony van Dyck's paintings. We weren't headed there with Pallas Athena. We're definitely not headed there with people, I would say hateful people in power who have given us in some ways the world that we exist in today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor J.B. Singh, for explaining, or rather challenging, the topics of the role of local in the global flows, the role of arts and culture in the value construction, and how global is perceived in the local physical space. And I guess the most challenging part for us would be how to translate cosmopolitanism to localism. And back. Now the floor is open for questions. We have microphones back, so please, we have time for a couple of questions to our keynote. Please raise your hand so we see where to bring the microphone.
Just speaking to either it was really persuasive or completely incoherent.
I'll get us started then. Thank you for a very interesting lecture, as always. I was thinking about our role as researchers, because you said that the only thing we can do as researchers is to carry on researching, but a lot of the processes of change that you have described since the 18th century also goes for research as an activity. We also have the universal claims, and we also, as you say, want to apply cosmopolitanism as researchers. And what do you think that our role could be in not only, as was mentioned earlier, describing this development, but also in initiating discussion and dialogue between different agents? Could you say something about that? The role of the researcher and the culture policy researcher.
As I get ready to go back to the US and have to teach a class in international trade, and starting in 2 weeks, I've really been thinking of that question. Can I just come into class and start talking about theories of comparative advantage to a set of people who don't believe in trade at all? No, culturally they don't believe, not economically, just culturally they don't believe. And I think all of us have probably shared that anxiety, and I'd love to hear from many others too, but how do we walk into not just our computers and research desks, but how do we walk into our classrooms and initiate conversations? This is my tentative answer. I've really been thinking about it. How will I teach my courses? One is in research methods, and the other one is called technology, culture, and commerce. It's not just international trade. And I think it'll be within my comfort zone. I was trained to think of hypotheses. Then my colleagues challenged me and they said hypotheses are very deductive. They are full of grand narratives, and they put forth a world that's patriarchal and all sorts of other things, and that I needed reflexivity. So I began to put my hypotheses in social context, and then was reminded that David Hume did the same in the 18th century. You know, the same Eurocentric figure that we hate so much, and so many quarters of Enlightenment thought, was saying that truth belongs in a social context. But given that it belongs in a social context, we still have our methods to then explore that context and to put forth tentative conclusions. And for me, that's the world that I think I can challenge my students and my colleagues with, that tentativeness, which is being riven apart in at least at an everyday level in our newspapers and other places by a very strong binary which says anything that speaks to tentativeness is fake news. No. So it may sound really poignant, but I think from, and I'd love to hear from other colleagues here, some of the most electrifying moments in our classes have been that respite for the students to think of that multidimensional world. Because cosmopolitanism is not a linearity, it's not a universalism with just one single conclusion, it is multidimensional. No. And that's probably the world that I want to keep reproducing in my head and in my classrooms.
I was also thinking that maybe the concept of ritual that you introduced, I mean, this conference in itself is a kind of ritual, bringing us together. The format of the parallel paper sessions is our way of deliberation and of talking to each other, of making it possible to talk to each other across different backgrounds.
And challenging each other. I think that's what I remember of a bus conversation, how politely we challenged each other.
Yes,
yes.
I agree.
Yeah.
So I had the second question, I think. Am I right?
I can hear. Oh, there you are.
At least I have a microphone now.
Right.
So, Beata Czepka, University of Wrocław in Poland. And I'm a bit surprised that you used Huntington for your speech today, for your talk today. Because Huntington has been feeding much of nationalism in Central and Eastern Europe, not only in this region, I would say. It contributes to the one-dimensionality of this region. I wouldn't say, by the way, Eastern Europe, because Estonia is a very good example how to escape from this bit, I think, a negative notion. I think some of the people presenting today use this idea that now the conference is organized in Eastern Europe. I did much research on nation branding in the region. Estonia is a wonderful example how the country punches above its wave with soft power, and how it actually tries with soft power, nation branding, how it tries to escape the idea that it's Eastern Europe in this negative sense of post-Soviet country. Still, if we are talking about cosmopolitanism, what is actually your idea to include Huntington to the presentations to your talks like today? Because, well, my impression is it's of course rooted also in my cultural background that actually Huntington has been feeding nationalism one-dimensionality, at least in this, I would say, Central Europe than Eastern Europe, but for sure it can be true also for Eastern Europe.
Thank you for that question. It allows me to clarify something that maybe was implied and I didn't make it explicit. I actually use Huntington in the very sense that you're using it now, except that the nationalism was a civilizational type of nationalism that's implied in the clash of civilizations. I mean, he's drawing this line right through Europe and saying, here are two civilizations. That's what I meant by the East and West. And I was using Huntington to speak to the old politics that still remain, just as I used the idea of North-South divisions to speak to how liberal internationalism that was being fashioned through that bourgeois piece also forgot a set of people. So similarly, Huntington's idea of this clash of civilizations, and as you're saying, might have in fact enabled that type of clash had that article not been written. However, I'd like to think that Huntington, too, is a scholar like us, that he was speaking to some of these forces in history that will always remain, but that can be galvanized. So I share with you the fact that in many ways Huntington is speaking to those divisions, and at the same time, perhaps many people would argue that he's fueling those divisions. So that for me, the Huntington part and the reference to paternalism was to make us rethink these conflicts that we thought had gone away but have now again reappeared, and who's being excluded from those conflicts. Somebody.
There's a question over there.
Thank you. Thank you for a very compelling presentation and sets of provocations. I'm Rika Sitas from the African Centre for Cities based at the University of Cape Town. I was wondering whether you could maybe talk a little bit more about the kind of social justice issues around kind of cultural policy and global power inequalities. I know that binary is unhelpful, north-south, etc. But coming from a southern context where one of the main things that's really important to deal with is around social and spatial justice. And I think it's kind of also evident in these sorts of spaces that are international, but not entirely. If you look at the representation from Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, I mean, how do we address this? How do we address this from a global perspective? I mean, I'm also very aware that I'm a white woman working in an African context, but from a southern perspective, that's really crucial. And I wonder sometimes whether cosmopolitanism is sometimes used to erase politics in a certain way, and can run the risk of kind of undermining the kind of justice issues and overthrowing these unequal power dimensions. Thank you.
I'm going to be equally provocative in my answer and actually not reference the global south. And I'm going to talk about Scotland. You know, the 33 global cultural fellows that we brought to Edinburgh, the hardest part for us was trying to find 5 from Scotland. I'm going to put forth to you something that I think we're all aware of at universities. We are the least connected with the places around us. We are the centers of enlightenment, of justice, of ethics, and progressive thought. And how many of us step into our own communities? When I tried to find 5 global cultural fellows from Scotland who weren't from the culture sector, I was sent to the External Relations Office, the Community Office. They gave me the GIS map. One of them showed me these GIS maps which could show where drug addiction was highest in Scotland, where people were less educated, where people were homeless, why they were homeless, different types of violence. There were all these maps and not a single name. What I want to get to is that place of justice would come from the very vocabulary that we speak. Who are these human beings? Let's identify them and bring them together. If there's something to justice and participatory techniques, then we have to be able to go beyond the abstractions and think of them as human beings. And we're cosmopolitan elitist, not just in these spaces, but in the universities in which we sit. I think most universities have a terrible record of interacting with their communities. I spent most of my career has been at Georgetown University, and I love that place, but I'll be its biggest critic. It's the most elite university in Washington, D.C., and it's run by Jesuits. There's a contradiction there, and the faculty know it, that we at Georgetown educated the elite, but don't connect with 3/4 of Washington, D.C., which is poor. It only connects with 1/4 of Washington, D.C., which produces people for the Congress and the Foreign Service in those places. So my answer would be that in order to get to justice and ethics, which is participatory, we're going to have to connect with communities in a very different sort of way. I'm a big propagator of field research. I do a lot of quantitative analysis, but this summer my field research was in Kenya and it was in India, and I think it's only through field research that we really hear the stories that we can represent in our research. Now this was the first time that I actually did ethnographic research, and I really realized then that I'll never be an anthropologist because they have the sort of patience that I never will. I told you I'll answer your question a little differently. For me, the question of justice has to start in the very spaces in which we are, and it has to involve many voices, and I think we're not very good at doing that at universities.
Yes, David Throsby from Macquarie University. JP, one of the most striking images and one of the most powerful images in what you were saying was the image of Pablo Neruda's poetry being read to the General Assembly of UNESCO, and it seemed to be saying that art was able to express things which the bureaucracy hadn't been able to express, and in some sense also that the institution had failed or was failing to represent the people that it was supposed to represent. And so my question is if we are indeed to move to a new and foster a new cosmopolitanism, which I think many, or indeed most of us, maybe all of us, would agree with, do we need new institutions to do that, or are there existing institutions in the world which need to modify what they do in order to make those sorts of things happen?
Oh, thank you, David. That's an excellent question, but a very hard one to answer. I think at a micro level, all our institutions are already aware of these fissures in cosmopolitanism and the exclusions. I have friends at the World Bank who would readily join a protest against the World Bank. And many of them would hesitate and say, no, I won't, because they pay my salary. And so it's not like people who work at the World Trade Organization or UNESCO or the World Bank are unaware of the kinds of exclusions that they might have to practice in their daily lives, just as we at universities don't connect with our communities, but at the same time we have fundamentally important ideas that we want to put forth for the world. So at a micro level, I think those processes are already there. Most people at UNESCO have already heard of the criticism that they may be in the cultural sector, the global ministry for culture telling the world what to do. And at some fundamental level, they put in place processes that address that. So the UNESCO Convention of Intangible Cultural Heritage that I mentioned earlier was, in some ways, was a part of that. At a macro level, and this is going to be my gut level response, we get big and great institutions after great conflicts. That's when we got UNESCO in 1945. There was, I think it was Sewell's book, where he speaks to how on one cold November morning they met in London and were able to formulate these final passages. But what's implied in that one cold November morning is a world that's defeated. That's what's implied in Kurosawa's Ran too. The Lear figure is defeated, and he has nothing but sort of a spiritualism to then take him forward. I don't think we're there yet. We might be in a year, and I hope we are not. But I think to get that type of fundamental change is not going to come about. However, our old institutions are clearly not working. So where I'm not able to go is that at the micro level, there are processes in place, people in place who are thinking of these conflicts. But at a macro level, I don't think we are at a point of great upheaval, but there is that disconnect. Perhaps not so much in culture, but in trade right now, the WTO could matter less. 20 years after we thought we had the neoliberal order, as many of my colleagues critiqued it, now you can see that I don't subscribe to that view, but in 1995 the world was being led by the WTO. In the year 2018, WTO doesn't matter at all. No, so in that sense, I don't know if we're going to get a new trading organization, but there is that disconnect.
Can we have the last question?
Oh, now I feel very pertinent asking questions for the last one. Thank you very much for the really interesting presentation. I really have been a big sort of fan of your view towards the cultural relations. You're hesitant to use the word diplomacy, and you're hesitant to the soft power as well. And so when I heard that you talked about that you didn't feel the term soft power did much to the world, however, you found that it was actually quite relevant after your research. I kind of felt that you were disappointment of your findings that it was really strongly connotated. My question is, sorry, I'm from the University of Tokyo, and I work a lot with Southeast Asia, especially with Malaysia, and in the cultural relations area. And when I do work with these countries in the global south, I would say, they are very hopeful about the power of soft power, power of the cultural diplomacy, power of soft powers, and you have just proven that it's very connected, yet that a lot of countries are walking away from it, and also yourself would hesitate to use the word cultural diplomacy. I would like to really hear of your opinion of how you would say to these global south countries who are very hopeful and wishing to go into the soft power diplomacy style.
I hesitated about soft power because I didn't know empirically what it did. So when I looked at all these branding indexes, Global Britannia, #1, #2, #3, and there are lots and lots of branding indices for soft power. Which countries? To me, there was a problem of methodologically what we call problem of endogeneity. Who's doing what to whom? Because if you're #1 and you're receiving the most students and your brand is really well recognized, then you don't know what the explanation is there. Because I was trying to say X leads to Y, but if I'm #1 or #2, what's happening then? So methodologically, that's where a lot of power definitions tend to be tautological, as I implied, because they say, oh, you have power because you have it. And so our task was to try to divorce the two, and I really thought once we do, we're going to find that it doesn't matter. So the surprise was it did. And where it mattered the most was in, and we don't have that graph up anymore, but in this very crudely constructed cultural institutions variable. What we did was to just count the number of countries where a country's cultural institutions were situated. By the way, in the British Council literatures and website, it's very hard to find how many countries they are in. They would say over 100, but do they have offices in those? So they were very crudely constructed measures. We tried to ascertain them. And then, Germany has several cultural institutions, not just one. Then Confucius Institute, it doesn't have just one office abroad. They have several in one particular country. So we had a very crudely constructed measure of how many countries your cultural institutions were. And what we found was that operating in all these countries was strongly correlated with getting more students, more foreign direct investment, more tourists, and having an influence. So that's where I was surprised. I wasn't surprised that it doesn't work. I was surprised that we actually came up with measures that we thought wouldn't work, and that we would have a very hard time. And I was thinking, how am I going to tell the British Council for whom I did the study that my results were inconclusive? What surprised me was that they were conclusive across several model iterations. And yes, the sadness was that it comes in a world in which a lot of the great powers don't believe in it. Now, I would say that from the reception just of the soft power study, maybe it is an exaggeration to say that not all great powers believe in it. I think UK remains interested in soft power. UK, in that sense, has a fundamentally different strategy toward the world after Brexit, and this may sound very controversial, than Donald Trump's America does. UK is trying to figure out how to engage with the world and the European Union, whereas I would say Trump's America, at least Trump's America, is thinking of how to disengage from the world, because that ostensibly has some benefits. So in that sense, I think this soft power study, as also many other soft power studies that are coming out of the UK and other places right now, do have a lot of reception in a lot of different places. There's one actually which just came out from the US Advisory Commission for Public Diplomacy, which speaks to the methodologies that small states adopt around the world for soft power, a Danish strategy that is very technologically led, a Swedish strategy on soft power, which is very much situated in foreign aid, international development assistance, and different other countries that practice it in different ways. So there are all sorts of stories to be told about soft power and all types of methodologies that are getting practiced. So despite my disappointment in my own results, and despite the sadness that these results come out of places that might be moving away from soft power, I would say yes, that it does work, and it works in various ways.
Okay, with that I would like to wrap up the first session of ICCPR, and I personally take along the thought which was raised here during the discussion, the role of scholars in transferring knowledge into local communities, our moral and ethics as scholars. On behalf of the organizing team, we also have a small gift for the presenter. May I open the gift so that it's it's not curious to see too. I'm sure everybody's really curious to see.
But what is it?
It's a sleeping mask.
Oh, wow.
You can transfer yourself into a panda bear, most likely. So the nights in this part of the world are light, so it will help you to fall asleep. But not only, you can also use them on airplanes and cheer up your fellows.
That would actually come in very handy in Washington, D.C., where I expect not to sleep. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I would kindly ask you not to leave the premises, but stay for snacks and drinks. And on behalf of the organizing team from Tallinn University, I would once again like to thank you for coming to Tallinn. We are very happy to host you here, and I do hope that you will have nice 4 days of conference. Thank you, and enjoy your stay.